Having Viking DNA doesn't mean that you should automatically construct a longhouse and start planning your ship burial, although you're absolutely free to do that if that's what your seafaring heart desires. And actually, having Viking DNA doesn't make you all that special. About 6% of Britons are likely to have Scandinavian DNA according to a study published in 2020, and about 10% of Swedes can claim Viking ancestry. To detract even further from your dream to claim that you're a descendant of Erik the Red, some historians argue that being a Viking was actually more of a lifestyle or job than a nationality. So, while it's likely that most Vikings would have been Scandinavian, not all Scandinavians were Vikings. As a result, even if you have got Scandinavian DNA running in your bones, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the urge to travel, raid monasteries, or quaff vast quantities of mead. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Viking Expansion. We all know that Vikings were avid explorers, raiding, travelling, and settling all over the world. Famous for their globe-trotting ways, they were likely to have left behind them a string of illegitimate children in various port towns across northern Europe. This isn't enough to explain the presence of Viking DNA among so many modern Britons though, no matter how hard they try. One of the best explanations for why so many people alive today have Viking DNA is down to their wandering nature and their tendency not only to raid, but to trade and settle in other countries. Throughout the Viking Age from 793 to 1066 AD, Scandinavian people travelled extensively and had close contact with people across northern Europe. This started mostly as sporadic raids, but developed into larger invasions and settlements as time went on. In the latter half of the 9th century, the Vikings changed their attitude towards the UK and larger armies began to land on Britain's shores with the intention of staying, this time for good. Viking Babies. It doesn't take a lot to realise that Viking DNA doesn't transmit spontaneously via osmosis. Mingling of genetic information needs contact. In some of these studies into genetics and migrations, this is also called input. Extended contact between Vikings and local populations led to plenty of Viking babies, and therefore Viking DNA entering into other communities. Viking settlement in the UK led to a region known as the Danelaw. Ruled by Viking leaders or Viking petty kings, this area spanned from just north of London up to the north and was dominated by Viking laws, customs and genetics. The Vikings didn't settle throughout this entire region, but 5 boroughs emerged as the most important: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stamford. For 80 years, the Vikings lived alongside the Anglo-Saxons, becoming part of the British landscape. The number of words that have entered into English from Scandinavian indicate that people lived closely, exchanging words for things like knife and sky, as well as anger and happy. The Vikings who ruled and settled in this region were primarily from Denmark, although the genetic information isn't exactly clear on how much they mingled. Genetic signatures aren't conclusive, which means that it's possible that the Danelaw was mostly inhabited with Anglo-Saxons and just ruled by an elite class of Vikings. Vikings, blue eyes, blonde hair, Berserk. While people with blue eyes and blonde hair would like to claim that they're descended from Vikings, these genetic traits don't actually always mean that you have Scandinavian ancestry. The study published in the journal Nature in 2020 examined 442 burials from over 80 grave sites across Europe, Italy and Greenland. We would expect the results to show that all these supposed Viking burials had Scandinavian DNA, but we'd be wrong. Some of the skeletons showed Sami and European ancestry, whilst others showed ancient Anatolian ancestry. To have been buried with Viking trappings but to have Sami DNA strongly indicates that being a Viking is more of a cultural identity than a genetic one. This is fully backed up by the fact that the majority of the skeletons examined showed high levels of non-Scandinavian ancestry, indicating that the Vikings didn't pay attention to borders when looking for a husband or wife, and instead just sowed their oats wherever they pleased across the European continent. The study also compared the historical DNA to that of present-day Danish people, and once again subverted modern expectations. The result of the study was that Viking Age people were more likely to have dark hair than be blonde, contrary to modern opinion, and actually were far more genetically diverse than you might believe. So who even were the Vikings, and how can we have their DNA today? Which country has the most Viking DNA? Unsurprisingly, this question isn't easily answered. The Vikings themselves were predominantly from the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. At this point, the region was made up of a number of smaller kingdoms and tribal areas which shared some common social and cultural elements but had their own individual identities. Denmark is generally held to be the place that we can first see evidence of Viking activities, with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 being carried out by Vikings from Denmark. In comparison, Vikings from Sweden mostly travelled east and ventured down the riverine network in Russia and became known as the Varangians. This means that Viking DNA spread all throughout Northern Europe and beyond, mingling with the people that they met almost more than anything else. For example, only about 15 to 30% of modern-day Swedes can trace their ancestry back to the Vikings, despite being one of the places that the Vikings came from. Other places that are strongly associated with Viking activity are Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern England, Normandy, Iceland, and Greenland. Each of these places will have a higher chance of having people with Viking DNA, particularly Iceland, which was almost exclusively settled by Vikings from Norway. Once again though, it's not that clear-cut. That being said, it would appear that you're most likely to have Viking DNA if you live in the UK, particularly Scotland or Northern England, as these were regions that were particularly heavily settled during the Viking Age. We can see the evidence of this in all areas, from place names to language and culture. It has been more difficult to track the demographic impact of the Vikings on the British population though. Studying the genetic makeup of a modern population can often give information about the history of the country, including the size and impact of any incoming populations, such as the Viking settlers. However, analysing modern-day Brits doesn't seem to have given any sort of conclusive answer as to whether Vikings came and settled, how far south this would have been, and where those Vikings came from. One particular study identified 17 genetic clusters that correlated with different regions around the UK, showing that people from Orkney had 25% Norwegian ancestry. This Orkney genetic cluster was also evident in the region previously known to be Northumbria, also a Viking-heavy region. On the other hand, another genetic cluster that was generally taken to be Saxon or North Germanic in origin might reflect Danish Viking involvement instead of Northern Germany. Haplogroup R1A1. Also nicknamed the Viking marker, Haplogroup R1A1 is commonly taken to be one of the strongest indicators of having Viking ancestry. Haplogroups are groups of mutations that are found in the chromosome and are passed from one generation to the next, giving a genetic marker that can identify common ancestors or populations. HGR1A1 is a male-specific haplogroup, meaning that it's one that's passed down from father to son on the Y chromosome. It's found in a large number of modern Norwegians and Swedes, as well as in Orkney, the Faroe Isles, Iceland, and Greenland, handily tracking the route of Viking migration and settlement, although some academics still have doubts as to whether this haplogroup actually proves Viking migration. One study published in 2020 looked at the genetic data and focused on the subgroups of HGR1A1 to see if it would be possible to trace Viking genetic influence in the Danelaw. Unfortunately, their data was inconclusive, indicating that although there might be a higher proportion of HGR1A1 in the Danelaw, without further investigation, it's not possible to say for certain if that means that you can claim Viking ancestry. Vikings in Ireland. Vikings had a dramatic impact on Ireland, ranging from founding urban settlements to the increased evidence of silver in the Irish economy. Once again, historical and archaeological evidence shows the presence of Vikings in Ireland, but how likely is it that you have Viking DNA if you live there? Well, once again, there's evidence to confirm the presence of Viking input in Ireland. In the study published in Nature in 2020, genetic evidence from Viking burials in Dublin and County Galway were analysed and showed that the invaders had high levels of Norwegian ancestry, supporting the theory that Norwegian Vikings mostly settled in Scotland and Ireland, whilst the Danish Vikings were more prominent in England. One of the interesting outcomes of this study showed that although one burial appeared to be authentically Viking from the grave goods and other traditions, the DNA taken from the skeleton actually just showed Irish ancestry. This means that there were enough Vikings present in Ireland at the time to share a culture, but it wasn't necessary to be born Viking to be given the honour of a Viking burial. Vikings in Scandinavia. It wasn't only an outpouring of Viking DNA into the world around them, there is evidence of genetic material flowing into Scandinavia during the Viking Age, although this isn't consistent and often disappears quickly. One example of this comes from Trondheim in the mid-14th century. It seems as though there was a British-Irish strain in the residents' genes that disappeared after the Black Death hit the city in 1347. The movement of genetic information back into the Viking countries is difficult to unravel. Is it due to slavery? Is it wives or partners coming back with single Viking raiders? Or is it related to high-status individuals who had travelled to Norway or Denmark on business? One study showed that the people from the east who settled in the Scandinavian countries were mostly women, which may have meant that the Viking raiders were finding wives in the UK and then bringing them back home. And Scandinavian DNA wasn't exactly pure to begin with. The 2020 study of the 442 skeletons showed that there was already genetic information from Asia and Southern Europe before the Viking Age even began. Migration is not a purely Viking activity, and the gene flow appears to have been constant throughout this period. This could be related to the trading hubs and other urban centres that flourished in the Viking era, drawing people in and leading to an intermingling of cultures and genetic information. So, do you have Viking DNA? Genetic studies are complicated, and even if the results seem clear and scientific, the explanation behind the data might not be so easy to understand. Some people use traces of Viking DNA to explain their true selves and use their genetic results to explain why they want to travel, or why their family is prone to violent outbursts. However, everything that we've seen so far indicates that being a Viking was more of a cultural identity than a genetic one, but it's quite likely that if you have any sort of European ancestor, you may well have Viking DNA. And even if your DNA shows that you have no trace of Thor in your veins, you can still claim allegiance to the Viking way of life. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you enjoy this content, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers, have a great week.